First, welcome. Excited to get to share space together again. Many of us have gotten the opportunity to learn and grow together, and excited to introduce everyone to Sarah Bruzzi. For those that don't know, Sarah used to work here at Community and now is on mission down in the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans, where she works as a part of the intersection and as well as a number of other ministries. And I don't know enough about your new job, so I'm going to let you talk about your new job.
Okay.
If that's cool.
Good.
Otherwise, I will butcher it.
No, we'll talk about it.
Sarah is going to be leading us as we talk with a lot of her community partners that she has been working with for a number of years and that have been working together for some of them for decades. So, we have done a lot of learning together about, all kinds of different things in the history of the US and in our current culture. But, there's also the question of, what does faith in action look like? And Sarah's been doing that really well for a long time and is also involved with a lot of community members that have been doing that well together for a really long time. And so they're going to be sharing their experience with us. So Sarah, I will go ahead and turn it over to you. And you can, give us a little bit more intro about the good work that you're doing now, because I know that some of that's changed recently, as well as, what you got planned.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I should pray. I didn't pray.
Yeah.
I always do this. Y'all wanna join me in prayer? God, we thank you for this day and this time and this evening. We thank you for the Bruzzis. We thank you for the ways that you have called them to love and to serve. We thank you for the ways that they are leading us, that they are teaching us, that we get to learn from them, for all the ways that we've gotten to learn together these past couple of years, and for the ways that you are calling us forward into our own communities, that we might also serve in faith and in action, making it on earth as it is in heaven. In your holy and precious name, we give thanks and we give praise. Amen.
Amen. So as Ben said, I'm Sarah, and you'll get to hear from Matt one of the other weeks, but I'm going to kind of be the orchestrator for the overarching class. And really, when Pastor Ben and I were beginning to talk about this, he said, I'd really love for you to talk about the lower Ninth Ward and the ministry that you're doing, but keeping in step with what I genuinely believe about our community. We didn't move to the lower Ninth Ward because the lower Ninth Ward needed us. And I think that is a good place for us just to begin, is that anytime we begin to talk about how do we do ministry, how do we enter into spaces, how do we partner together with people, is coming at it from a place of true and total humility and being able to, say, God is already working. God is already moving, regardless of what I see, regardless of what I think, regardless of what I feel. God is already there doing stuff. And so when I talked to Ben, I was like, I'm going to have to get a whole bunch of other people involved. So over the next few weeks, you're going to hear from people that are really genuinely near and dear to my heart, as you all are. You guys partnered with me for so many years there and are continuing to do that. They're partnering with us here. And so when I even wrote them and to ask them like, hey, will you do this? I wrote that it was a personal and a professional request, because these are friends of mine. They've sat in my house. I've sat at their tables. They've sat at mine. And so I just pray that this can be a learning experience for all of us, because that's the other thing that I really have genuinely learned, I think, over the last 9 years of living in our neighborhood, is as soon as I think I understand something, I realize the 12 other things that I don't understand. And so as we go through this, please feel free to interrupt me. I can talk 12 miles an hour. I've also been on this particular journey for a while. And so there's so much I want to talk about and so much I want to say, and can't fit it in. So if something didn't make sense, or I jumped over something, or you're like, oh, no, I have a question about that. If you can raise your hand, and Ben, can you interrupt me? So because I probably won't see it.
Yep.
But as Ben said, the reason why I have these different connections is because of the ministries that I'm partnered with here in our neighborhood. So you're going to be hearing from Leona Tate. She was one of the 6-year-old girls that you have seen in all of the newsreels from 1960. She was the 6-year-old girl that integrated McDonough 19. She was the first school to be integrated in the Deep South. She is a good friend of mine, and that school is right around the corner from our house. And so that's actually where I work now. I became friends with Leona a number of years ago. And when my other job that wasn't working out, I said, you know what? She needed somebody to do her fundraising and development work. And that's what I had been doing at my other job. And so I am not volunteering, but I'm doing it for a massively reduced rate to kind of help them out as a gift to the community. Next, you'll be hearing from Reverend Calhoun and from Matt. Rev has been in the neighborhood since he was a little boy, and he is currently in his mid-70s. And just in the last 2 years, he has begun pastoring a church in the neighborhood. And so he's kind of taking all of his work that he's been doing, all of the community activism that he's been doing, and translating that into a more formal church body. And so he's kind of walking through that process. You're going to hear from Laura and MA talking about housing. Neither of them are in fact Christians, but are people that are doing the Lord's work very much so in our neighborhood, fighting for people to have houses. Before the levees broke during Hurricane Katrina, we had 59% home ownership rate. And that was the highest Black home ownership rate in the entire country. Because of the ways that houses have been rebuilt since the storm, that generational wealth has been lost. And so both of them have been on the front lines of getting those laws changed and getting people to be able to be in their homes, stay in their homes, and have equity. You're going to hear from, I did education, I did housing, I'm forgetting church. We're going to learn from somebody who is on the front lines of climate change. He has a nonprofit in the lower 9th ward that is specifically working on climate change. So that'll be something that I'm sure as Floridians, you guys will all be very interested in hearing. But what I want you to hear through all of the different talks, through what I say today, through each of them, is that none of them were indeed trained in this way. They didn't seek to be the head of anything. They simply came with what they had. And so that's where all of us need to be as we're kind of walking through this process, asking the questions of how do we be of service? How do we usher in God's kingdom here on earth? Is that God is not asking us to transform our own lives. He's not asking us to transform anybody else's life. He's got that. He's simply asking us to come with what we have. And so that is kind of an introduction of what we're going to be talking about. Ben, do you want me to keep just going or?
You're good. All yours.
Okay. Does everybody have by chance a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil or quick access to one? We're just going to do a quick activity. So if you don't, like, it's not the end of the world, but if you have it, grab that for me.
Anybody?
Give me a thumbs up when you're there because I can't see everybody well enough. I got a couple thumbs up.
All right. I got paper. Okay.
Okay, you guys ready?
Yep.
Okay, so we're just gonna do a quick game. So when I say a word, you're gonna write down the first word that pops into your head, but you can't cheat. You can't think, what if I say this and she thinks it's wrong? There's no right or wrong. You just have to write down whatever the first thing is that pops into your head. So an example would be is if I say chocolate, The first word that pops into my head is always vanilla. And you would just write down vanilla or bar, or I don't know what else pops into your head because it doesn't pop into mine.
I did Hershey. I did Hershey.
Sorry,
I did
Yeah,
Hershey.
you thought Hershey? Okay. So the first word is hot.
Hat?
Hot.
Hot. Cat is in a cat.
Hot. No. Hot. H-O-T.
Oh,
Oh, hot.
Hot. Sorry. I apparently have an accent. I heard it as it came out.
Yep.
Okay. Stinky.
Stinky.
Oh.
Stinky. S-T-I-N-K-Y. Stinky.
I
I feel like I'm doing a spelling test for my fourth graders. Okay. Green.
I didn't get it.
Green.
Green. Oh,
Green. G-R-E-E-N.
thank you.
The United States. The church. Florida. And lastly, the gospel. Okay, so this is going to kind of be mass chaos, but we're going to go through them. And when I say the word again, I want you to say out what you said. And I want to hear what everybody said. Okay, for the word hot.
Cold.
Potato.
What did you say, Ben?
Potato, hot potato.
Oh, I
Oh,
had cold like a lot of the others. I did not think potato. I love that. Stinky.
Bad smell.
No, I had socks.
Oh, I got that too.
Did you?
Now you have kids.
Oh, kids.
Yes, I can
So
tell you
true.
have kids.
Okay, green.
Grass.
Growing.
Growing, grass.
Mold. Yeah, the
Mold.
Oh,
Okay, what about the United States?
America.
I realized a lot of mine was just continuation of words.
I heard America. I couldn't, there was too much of, what else do we have?
America. I had America.
Freedom.
Freedom,
Us.
us.
As in.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay, the church.
Steeple.
God's house. Love.
God, love,
Steeple.
steeple,
God's workers.
workers. I saw Kelly posted a picture, one of my favorite shots from the parking lot up to the church this morning, and that image comes into my mind.
Yeah.
What about Florida?
Sunshine.
Insurance. You
It's-
can know what I've been doing lately.
So it's interesting. I think almost everybody said hot, but when I said hot, you didn't think Florida.
I did.
You did? Oh, that's awesome.
Oh, you Florida earlier?
When you said hot, I said Florida.
Okay, well, there you
Nice.
go. Okay, the last one was the gospel.
According to
Jesus.
The Bible.
Jesus.
I heard Jesus, the Bible, according to
oh,
according to Paul. Okay, that's awesome. So the reason why I had us do that is obviously one, to get us talking. But the second one is because I really want to focus on the term the gospel. And it kind of gives us the jumping off point. We heard things like Jesus, we heard things like according to Paul, we heard a lot of different things that pop into our mind. But in the New Testament, the Greek word that is used for gospel is actually euangelion. And it's directly translated as good news or the good message. And over the century, though, while this used to have a much broader term and much broader understanding, it's kind of been whittled down in some circles to this little tiny thing that simply means that we're sinful people and Jesus died for us so we could be with God forever. That it was kind of, it took the writings of Paul and shrunk them all down into this just very simple thing, and that in order to believe, in order to be considered a Christian, in order to fill in the blank, you had to believe this sentence. But I'm going to say what all of us have experienced and maybe are not necessarily willing to say is that feels a little flat. If the gospel is just what happens when we die, where we go when we die, what happens when we're sitting in the doctor's room and we're told we have cancer? What happens when we get the phone call that somebody has passed away? What happens when our sister has lost her job, or our husband is dealing with depression, or the list could go on? And I'm sure each of you are sitting there thinking of a situation either now or recently of real everyday life. And if we take the good news and we shrink it down to only mean in the future, only when we die, only at the end, what about the here and now? What about that good news that is supposed to, and what we see throughout scripture that actually shows that it makes a real impact on our daily lives? And that's why when Pastor Ben and I were talking about really what the title of the course would be, he came up with "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." We say that all the time. We say the Lord's Prayer. I remember memorizing it when I was in elementary school, and really, it was just a prayer to memorize. I thought, you know what, check mark, I know how to pray well, right? It says right before it, he's going to teach us how to pray. And I didn't really think much about what does that actually mean? But when you actually deal with real people and you actually have relationships with real people, whether or not in your home because you're married and you have kids, or you have a roommate, or in your community with your neighbors or with your extended family, all of a sudden real life hits, and you have to have an answer for that. And that's really what the intersection is. The mission of the intersection is to meet people at the intersection of daily life and the hope of Christ, or with the good news. Because what we believe is that God came here on earth to meet us here on earth, and now we're his hands and feet. We need to be doing the same. It's not just for the future. And ultimately, it's about restoring shalom. And this is another word that unfortunately we have absolutely butchered. Does anybody know what shalom means? I heard somebody, but I couldn't actually catch what they said.
Peace.
Anybody?
Peace. Peace.
Peace. And that's what we've said over and over and over again. And that's part of it. But here's where we have to kind of expand our understanding, and we have to really look at scripture from the beginning to the end, because every time we hear that word, it actually means a little bit more than that. It's actually meaning wholeness or completeness. And when we're talking about our relationship with God, we're talking about that wholeness and completeness that we have been missing since the fall. Us receiving that living water, us receiving that forgiveness that we all need, us having him guide and direct us. But it also is shalom between us and others. It doesn't take long for us to realize that as we're interacting, we have some conflicts. I remember having this conversation with somebody a number of years ago, and they said, you know what, kids have to be taught to be mean and evil and all those kind of things. And I said, have you ever actually interacted with two small children? Because they know really well how to break that relationship and say, it's all about me. And they're going to yell and they're going to kick and they're going to scream. Not that my children would ever do such things, and they never argue and they never fight. But I didn't sit down and teach them that. I didn't sit down one day and go, you know what, Ainsley, you need to take all of the toys from Eleanor, and Eleanor, you know what you need to do? You need to drive your sister absolutely crazy. And so all of us have these broken relationships, not only with God, but also with the people around us. And so God is seeking to not only restore that relationship with him, and we talked about that. The good news means that restoration of our relationship with him, but it is also the restoration of our relationships with those around us. But here's the challenge. As you probably well know, what do we like? We like our space. Here in America, we want our space. We want our time. We want to decide things on our own. We want things the way that we want them. I'm willing to serve, but it has to be on Saturday morning between 10 and 2 because I have breakfast on Saturday morning at 8 a.m. and I have a hair appointment at 4 a.m. or 4 p.m. I am willing to teach, but I'm only willing to teach from the hours of 8 and 3 because the rest of the time I need for myself. And not that those things are bad, but we've kind of flipped things on our head where we want our relationships, we want our time with others, we want these experiences, but we want them on our own time frames. But what happens when life happens? I remember like the number of times I received a phone call from a student 9, 10 o'clock at night because they were in a crisis. The phone call I received because Mike Fordham's wife died and all of a sudden his kids were left without a mom happened at 3 o'clock in the morning. The lady who lives down the street who is pregnant and doesn't know what to do about it, she showed up at my door at like 6 a.m. What happens when life happens? It doesn't happen on my time schedule. I have 2 kids. I have multiple jobs. I have a husband. I have a ministry. I have a house. I mean, the list can go on and on and on and on. And for all of us, we have to look at what does it actually mean for us to be in shalom, not only with God, him, we trust him with our lives, we trust him with our steps forward, but what about the people next to us? Are we trying to cram them into a box so they fit into our neat and orderly schedule, or are we allowing them to enter in? Because when we look back at Genesis chapter 1, we are not left, Adam and Eve were not left to just be by themselves. God gave them specific instructions to have dominion, and that's the English word that we use, dominion over the earth. But when we actually dig into it, in the 2 different words that are used, they actually are to mean to protect and to serve. Sorry, my in-laws just showed up and my dog is going berserk. So when we look at, like I said, when we look at Genesis chapter 1 and we look at Genesis chapter 2 and we look at what God has actually called us to, he didn't just say, I want you to be in Eden so that you have this perfect relationship with me. But he also said we're to have dominion where we are to serve and we are to protect. And so often we look and we go, well, you know, they can make their own decisions. We're really big on letting people have their own thoughts, their own ideas, their own opinions, their own way of doing things. But God says we're actually supposed to be kind of in the mix. But not in the mix of we're controlling. We're not in the mix of telling people what to do and how to do it. But we're so close to them that we're there to serve for what they need and to help to protect. One of the greatest examples that I've read is actually in 1 Kings 17, and it's the widow of Zarephath. And many of you have probably heard of it, but it's in the middle of a horrendous, horrendous drought. And there are no crops and there are no food. And Elijah, the prophet, comes into Zarephath and he comes to a widow. And he says to her, go and prepare this meal for me. And she has already determined in her mind, I can't do that. I don't have enough for that. I can't do any of this for you. You're the man of God. You know, I only have this little bit. I can take this oil and this bread, but this is the it. We're planning on dying tomorrow. She had already predetermined what her box was. She was willing to follow God. She was willing to help the man of God. She was willing to only go so far as long as it fit in her little box. But the thing is she didn't know what God was going to do next. And when we're faced with a situation where somebody is coming to us because we've built this relationship and they're coming to us and it doesn't fit into our box and we think there's no way we can help them and we don't have anything to offer except this little bit of oil and this little bit of flour, God is asking us to give it to him. Because if you remember what I said at the beginning, we're not in control of the transformation. We're not in control. Like, we're not there to bake the bread and hand him a full loaf of bread. He asked for the oil and the flour, all that she had, and he did the rest. And so as we continue to ask these questions about what comes next for us, how do we enter into a next phase of ministry, a more holistic phase of ministry, we have to remember the two different things is that first off, we can't predict the future. We cannot determine what relationships we're going to make. We're not going to determine what is going to come from those relationships, just like the widow. And the second thing is that God is not asking us to have it all together before we do it. The widow didn't have the fully cooked loaf. She simply had the oil and the flour. That's all that she had. And similarly, God is asking that same thing of us. As we enter into these relationships, as we enter into this process, as we begin to think about how could we do this a little differently, things don't feel quite right. The good news is not quite being the good news for the people around me. It's not quite reaching them in the way that it needs to. It's not transforming their lives. We need to begin to see and begin to recognize what God is asking of us, to bring what we have and to not try to control the future. And so that's one of the things that I hope that you begin to hear as we are going through these next 5 weeks, is that the people that you're going to meet are kind of the experts now, but they've been doing this for like 20, 30 years. Matt and I are the new kids on the block. We've only been here 9 years. And trust me, we are reminded of it regularly. We're newcomers. We're not experts in anything. But each of them, and I hope this comes out, is that they just brought what they had. And God has used them and broken down barriers and tied those different organizations and the different lives of these people together in order to transform a community. So with that being said, I do want to give us some, actually, let's stop there. Does anybody have any comments, thoughts, something that stuck out to you, something you're like, Sarah, what the heck? Why did you say that kind of thing before we move on to the next part? Okay, then I'm going to keep going. So I want to give us a little bit of context of the lower 9th ward, because each of you have a specific context. And like I said at the very beginning, one of the things that I learned really early on is that if we were going to be doing ministry in this community, is I was going to have to learn a whole lot. I was going to have to learn the history. I was going to have to learn about the culture. I was going to have to learn about the systems and how we got to where we are. And then continue to ask those questions of what else, what next. And so my encouragement to each one of you is, as I'm going through these specifics for the lower ninth ward, just to set up the context for the next 5 weeks, is for you to begin to think about, God has probably already placed somebody or something on your heart. And he's kind of probably already pushing a little bit and going, hey, what if you start doing this? And you might not be able to see very far ahead, but you've got a small beginning of a context that you could begin to research and begin to understand a bit more about. So that's kind of where this came from, is me realizing God placed the lower ninth ward on our hearts for us to live in this particular community, but I had a whole lot to learn. I knew nothing. But so I'm going to share my screen for a second, if I can get my computer to cooperate with me. Share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's not the greatest because it's a screenshot, but you can see kind of the area, this red line. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you can see this red line. This is the lower ninth ward. And it is called the lower ninth ward because it is downriver of the city. The French Quarter, which is like the heart of New Orleans, if anybody's been to New Orleans or heard of New Orleans, the French Quarter is what you've learned about. It's only 2 miles from here. So I'm going to show you. I kind of did a couple of different of these so that you could see the different perspectives. Here we go. So you can see again, here's the red. The French Quarter is right here.
Mm-hmm.
Where my cursor is. But this actually shows the entirety of New Orleans. It's actually a very, very tiny city, but you can see how close the lower ninth ward is. And the lower ninth ward actually started, or the more, I guess, when you start researching it, being classified as the lower ninth ward, because obviously we know there were people there before this particular time period. But mostly this was swamps, and it became incorporated into the city in 1852. New Orleans is a very, very, very old city. It was founded in the early 1700s and was a major port for enslaved people. But the unique thing about the lower ninth ward is actually it was filled with people, immigrants from all over the world, primarily Irish, Italian, and formerly enslaved people as well. They recognized that because of the geography of the city was booming. The city had all of these industries that were all along the river, and they wanted to be a part of it, and they wanted to be able to take part in what was going on and be able to get a piece of that. But right along the river, and I wish that I kept up the map. Sorry about that. So right along the river here, this would be what you would consider higher ground. And though it is technically part of the lower ninth ward, the lower ninth ward actually does stretch all the way to the Mississippi River. This area right here, what is known and is called Holy Cross. And it was owned by only white people because they had more money and more opportunity at that time. And so these other groups of people wanting to still participate in all of the industries that were coming up through the Mississippi River into the city started clearing this land. And it actually became quite an oasis. For the first couple hundred years, when people would come down to the lower ninth ward, they would comment about the cypress trees and the shade. And when they were building the houses, they built them a little bit further apart so that there was grass and there were yards. And so particularly as you moved into the early 1900s, families were moving from other parts of the city to the lower ninth ward because they wanted to have a space for their family to grow. They wanted to have a place where their kids could play in the grass. And in an urban area, that is a very unique thing. And even to this day, even though a lot of our grass is overgrown and the lower ninth ward looks a little different, that's still what you'll see. Every house has grass. Every house has a fenced in yard. And because of its isolation, because the city purposefully didn't start building and start incorporating sanitation and water and everything, as well as because it was kind of separated by the industrial canal that they built, the lower ninth ward became a self-sustaining community. Everybody would describe the neighborhood as a place where you could go to get anything you wanted. There were grocery stores in every corner. There was the barbershop. There was the laundromat. There were movie theaters. There were roller skating rinks. Okay. There were restaurants. There were nightclubs. There was literally everything that you could possibly imagine in the neighborhood. And for many, many, many years, and even to this day, when we come up to an election time, people would say, you have to carry the lower ninth ward or you're not going to get anywhere. Because the neighborhood had bonded together to get everything that they had, and they knew the power of coming together as a community. If a kid was outside and they were doing something they weren't supposed to be doing, before they got home, they already knew about it and their parents nailed them for it because everybody was part of that family. And so this is what led us to the 1950s and into the early 1960s, when the NAACP was looking for families to desegregate the schools in New Orleans. Because remember, Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954. We're now in 1960 and it still hasn't happened. And the state of Louisiana, the city of New Orleans, the school board, the legislature, and everybody was fighting actively against desegregating the schools. It was the families in the lower ninth ward who signed up through a petition in the newspaper in order to send their kids to be the first to desegregate the school. Because they had the community, they had the support. They weren't just doing this on their own. They weren't isolated. They were a community. Unfortunately, most of us have heard about the lower ninth ward in such negative terms. And so the question is obviously what happened? Well, when desegregation took place, and when we see this throughout our country, oftentimes when there is turmoil, there's always a loud voice of somebody saying, well, look at them, look at what they've got, trying to get us to look at other people and blame them for their situations. If you remember what I said, the neighborhood was incorporated in 1952, and it was a mixed race community. It was a community of hardworking, blue-collar families, all working together side by side. But when desegregation happened, the white families in the community believed the lie that it was all of the Black people's fault. And so what happened was, I'm going to pull up my map again. Apparently I exit out of it. So you give me 1 second. You can tell I haven't taught by Zoom in a while. Here we go. Come on. Okay. Okay. So what happened was you had the school that was desegregated, actually where this canopy plant company logo is. All of the families that were living here in this community, the white families that were living in this community, pulled their kids out of their local school and they moved across this line to the parish. And when that happened, it took out a lot of the resources and it created this vacuum. And so unfortunately, by the time you hit into the 80s and 90s, when we hear about the crack epidemic, you have drug dealers coming into the community. They didn't necessarily live there. And you had people driving in from the parish to buy drugs in the neighborhood. And it was causing all of this violence. And the news then picked up on these stories and completely destroyed the image of the community. Because we already know what was actually happening. We already know that these were families that had lived here for generations and generations, for hundreds of years. We had already said that there was 59% home ownership, and over half of those families didn't have mortgages. The reality didn't match what was unfortunately being touted in the news. And so that's kind of where we're going to leave off, because that's what happened right up until the levees failed during Hurricane Katrina. And so they're going to kind of talk about that over the next 5 weeks. Okay, so then what did we do after that? So the last thing I want to just mention before we split into small groups are a couple of things I want us to kind of keep in our mind, again, as each individual is speaking over these weeks, is I want us to keep these in mind so that we can think, okay, this is how it played out for them. This is how it played out in their lives, how it played out in their ministries, in their relationships. But then what does it mean for me? Because this class is going to do no good if it's just me sitting here talking, or it's going to be the other people talking, just sharing their experiences. If at some point we don't take it to that next level and begin to analyze, okay, if they did it this way, then what does it look like for us? And so the first one I've already mentioned actually is we need to enter it with a state of humility. That we're not coming to people, we're not coming to a community, we're not coming to relationships saying, you know what, I know what you need. You've got this problem, I have this solution. That we need to come to it as fellow people who also need help. As fellow people who, I've also got problems, I've also got issues, I've also got conflicts, I've also got, and the list could go on and on. And so as we're beginning to look at this, we're talking about a relationship, and the relationship can't just go one way. That is a horrible feeling. I remember when we first moved to the community and we began to see giant tour buses driving through our community, and I'm sitting there looking and going, they're here to look at us. All of the there were over 100 nonprofits that were started in that. You saw how tiny the lower ninth ward is. Over 100 nonprofits that were started after the levees failed during Katrina. And there are only 10 that remain now. They all came in and they were like, oh, we're going to help these poor people. But it wasn't a relationship. They did not come in with an air of humility. They came in with, we know what you need. And then they hightailed it out of there. The second one I want us to remember is that we need to listen. And this is not always easy for me. I am very quick to speak. I like to talk. I am a verbal processor. I blame my mother. She is also a verbal processor. But the quickest thing I learned is I have to listen. I have to shut my mouth. If I'm invited to a space, particularly one that on paper I look like I shouldn't be a part of, then I need to close my mouth. And for a number of reasons. The first one is I don't know the answers. I don't have it all together, but it comes across as if I do. Even though I'm processing and I'm thinking, a lot of people don't do it that way. And so we need to be able to sit back and listen. But the other thing is, as you get to know people, as you begin to build these relationships, as you show up in a space, people are going to begin to talk, and they're going to say one thing, but you're going to hear another. I'm so angry that my kid was kicked out of class today. But what you hear is how embarrassed that parent is, and they don't know what to do with their kid, and they just need somebody to come alongside and to sit and to listen. But if I were talking and I were trying to give that mom, like, oh, you should have just done this, and you could have just done that, and oh, you should have talked to the teacher about this, I would have missed what was actually being said, what that person actually needed. And so unfortunately, this is also an area that the church, and I mean this, the church universally, and particularly the United States, is we've kind of bought into the belief that the church can just program relationships. If somebody is grieving, we just start a grief support group. Or if somebody is struggling with a child, a rebellious child, then we just do a parenting class. And not that those things are bad. I have multiple degrees in church leadership, and I love the church, and I love programming, and I love classes. But often where we need to step in, it's not going to happen in those times because we pretty ourselves up, right? You would never know I was in the pool swimming with my kids 20 minutes before I was in this class because I took the time to take a shower and I did my hair, and you didn't get to see the reality of me shoving food in my face and all of those things. And so we need to make sure we're creating those spaces where we can genuinely listen and not just program things. The third one is we need to ask questions. And I don't mean out loud. A lot of times when we get into spaces and we don't understand something, we are quick to ask questions. And sometimes that's good, particularly if we're in a class. But when we start talking about people's hurts and we start talking about really being in relationships with people, oftentimes the people that we're sitting with should not be the ones explaining it to us. And what I mean by that is I could sit, and I already told you I'm good friends with Leona Tate. When I met Leona, I had no clue who she was. No clue. I had heard of Ruby Bridges, and many of you have probably as well. And I had even taught about Ruby Bridges in my class, but I had never heard about Leona. And when I found out who she was, it would have been really easy for me to sit down with Leona and just say, Leona, teach me everything you know. She is the wrong person to be answering all of those questions because she's the one who went through the trauma at 6, at 8 when she did it again at Sims Elementary, at 11 when she then went to Cone and did it again, and at 14 when she then went to Nichols High School and did it again. She tells her story as a part of being an executive director, but that's vastly different than me sitting down and peppering her with all of these questions. I had to ask the question of, I need to learn this story and I better do some of work. I need to put the onus on myself to learn about this. So if we're coming to somebody who maybe is struggling with an addiction, or we're coming to somebody who is struggling with grief, or we're coming to a different culture, put the onus on ourselves, begin asking the questions and start researching the heck out of it. Not that you're going to get all the answers, but then when you come with those questions, you're not putting the burden on the person that you're talking to. You can come as an equal partner rather than a needy person who's just kind of sucking the life out of them. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And then the last one is it does require action. I think a lot of times when we enter into new spaces, and particularly with hot topics, and we can talk about race, we could talk about religion, we could talk about LGBTQ topics, we could talk about all of these different things, we get so nervous that we're going to do the wrong thing, we're going to say the wrong thing, we're going to act in the wrong way. And what I have found is if I do those first 3 things, where I enter in a space of humility, I listen first and I look around and make sure the right people are at the table. Maybe the people who are in the back who never get invited to the table, who need a voice, need space to speak. And if I begin to do the research myself, if I act and I enter into that hurt, I enter into that pain, I enter into that uncomfortable space, I might screw it up. And I've screwed it up so many times, but people are gracious and generous to forgive. And so we can't let the fear of doing it wrong stop us from trying, from being Christ's hands and feet. And so as we move forward in the last few classes, we need to really be thinking about where is God beginning to open my eyes to maybe a problem that I hadn't thought about before, or to a friend who is hurting, or to a community that is in pain, or looking outside my door. What do I see going on around me? So that would be the first one, is looking around, like, where is God kind of tickling me and saying, I might be kind of wanting you to kind of move in that direction. And then the second one is to look and say, what is the flour and the oil that God has already given me? It's not the full loaf of bread. It is not fully formed. It has not been baked. It has not been anything. It has not been put into the hands of Jesus yet to do what he does. But what has he already given me that he's asking me to give back to him to use? And so with that, are there any questions, comments, thoughts, things that you're, again, you're going, what? Okay, then I'm going to hand it back to Ben, and he's going to separate us out into small groups.
Cool. With the numbers we have, I think we'll just break out in an in-person small group and one online small group.
Okay.
And we will go over the questions that Sarah just left us with. So sort of sit and reflecting. I sort of thought we'll sort of do it how we've done in some of the past ones, where once your small group is done, feel free to head out. So just a couple of housekeeping things, and then we'll pray, and then we'll break out for small groups. So we've got 5 more weeks. Sarah's got speakers lined up each week. She'll sort of be introducing them, and we'll get to meet them, learn about the ministry that they're doing, what they're a part of in various education, climate. I can never do stuff off the top of my head. Housing,
Church, like
Education,
neighborhood
housing.
community,
Yeah,
and
housing.
Yes.
Right. Okay, cool. So yeah, each week we'll sort of take a different focus. And then each week we'll also break out into small groups and sort of talk about what we learned and how can we apply that to our lives and our context. Because if we can't apply it, then are we really leaning into the gospel? If it's just a for later thing, which was what Sarah was talking about at the beginning. So questions before we pray.
I do also want to say I have a resource page kind of put together for those of you who want to start reading and kind of pursuing some of these topics. There's 2 books on there that I have read and have really made a huge difference, kind of shaping the way that I think about this kind of work. There's also the websites for, or at least the social media for the different people that are going to be speaking. So if you're wanting, again, if you like to do things ahead of time and wrap your mind around it ahead of time, then you can kind of do that. So we will make sure we get that sent out to you either today or tomorrow or Friday.
Yeah. And one last thing, everyone is volunteering to talk to us from the goodness of their hearts and Sarah's benevolent relationships with them. But they are a part of nonprofits that if you would like to contribute to, you're more than welcome to. And so that is a way that we can support them and their ministries if you so feel inclined. And so, we'll be sure to mention what those are and how we can support them if you feel that.
Is it all part of that urban impact ministry, or is it something?
I will email out information every week.
Okay.
Yeah, and so each week with the coming week, I'll send some stuff out that me and Sarah will sort of send out some information about what's going on with each person that's talking, and a link to their website, and if you would like to contribute to that, how you can do that. Cool.
And
Yes.
one last thing, at that point, you will also have, everybody probably already has my email address, but if not, please, if you're going throughout and you think of a question or you want to talk something through differently, you feel free to email me, call. My number is actually still the same as it was when I was there. But if not, you're more than welcome to it. Because I really do want this to be something that is useful for you. And so I know for some people sitting in a class like this is ideal. That's me. I love classes like this. But for others, I know they need to talk, they need to process, they need to kind of work through things. So please feel free to reach out. You're not bothering me in any way, shape, or form. I would love to have those conversations. So
yeah, and also Sarah and I have been talking about working on a pilgrimage to go visit their ministry and the ministries that we're going to be talking about and working with. And so we're still trying to figure out what that might look like. But that is something that is on the table that we're hoping to make happen.
That was my question.
Okay.
After the 5 weeks and sometime this summer, is there a field trip?
It would probably be like in the fall, because it's sort of gonna be around everyone's schedules. Yeah, so, but that
And
would be.
nobody wants to come to New Orleans when it's 300 degrees. Ask Faye. Faye really liked it when she came and she was cutting down weeds and it was interesting outside.
Yeah, so, yeah, that, that is part of the plan for sure. Yeah, because, it is, context is important, right?
Right.
So, being in place and in space, brings a depth and breadth that, sitting around a table, we can learn a lot. But we learn a lot more with our hands and our feet. Would anyone like to wrap this time in prayer? And if not, I'm more than happy to. God, thank you so much. We thank you for Sarah and her and Matt and the kids' work and the intersection. We thank you for all that Sarah has shared. We thank for this week of preparation as we prepare our hearts, our minds, and our souls to be humble, to listen first, to ask deep questions, to do our homework, that we might be prepared to be discipled by the people that you have sent into our lives in these coming weeks. We might learn from them the ways that you have used them in their context to make our place more clear here, to make where you are calling us more clear in our lives, that we might be on mission with you, loving your people and being loved by them. In your holy and precious name we pray. Amen.